Good evening. Welcome to the fifth and final lecture in the Design Forum lecture series for this semester. We're truly fortunate to be able to end this series with tonight's speaker. Werner Oechslin was born in Switzerland. He studied art history, philosophy, mathematics, and archaeology at the University of Zurich, where he received a PhD in 1970. He is a scholar of 18th century and contemporary art and architecture. He has taught at MIT, the University of Berlin, the University of Geneva, and is currently chair professor of the history of art and architecture at the ETH in Zurich. He is an editor of Daedalus, the Berlin Architectural Journal, and an editor of Archithes, a Swiss magazine of art and architecture. His knowledge of the history of architecture is profound, but he is an historian who thinks with his eye as well as his mind. It is a sharp and unerring eye. His ongoing research into the history and use of architectural drawings, the traditions of perspective, axonometry, rendering, and projective geometry reveals a concern not simply with the overt history of buildings, but rather with the tools of their making. Since it is in the tools or the technique of the architect that tradition is necessarily embodied. His research, however, is more than a private obsession. Through his active interest and involvement with current architectural work, he seeks to elucidate the connections of such work to specific historical traditions, connections which the architect himself may only be half aware of. Please join me in welcoming tonight's speaker, Professor Werner Oechslin.
Thank you for this presentation. I have some problems. My problems are introduced to this new surrounding. I'm the first time here in LA and was told by many people that LA is an anti-intellectual world. And my theme is specifically intellectually orientated, and I have to deal with this specific problem. And when I see that what is happening right now, we have two videos, we have two slide machines, we have lots of attrezzature of technical instruments, and I would prefer to have just one thing, attention to some of our own instruments, and I would try to go into the history of use of our own intellectual instruments in favor of architecture and architectural science. Now, I changed my introduction. I was here Monday evening when Peter Cook spoke here to you, and I suppose that most of you were present. And I made some notes for myself, and I make my introduction by quoting some of these notes. Peter Cook, who is known and who declares himself being not the typical European, at least not the continental one, and therefore being not as systematic or as theoretically orientated than Europeans would probably be, introduced somehow his lecture by saying it is quite reasonably said, that architecture is weird. And this for typical contradiction, whatever. But then showing his work, he spoke about ambiguities, but he spoke about analogies, just to illustrate or to go into possible illustrations of how he came to his version or to his invention of architecture. And Kristen Hawley was then very clear when she said, well, going into that particular project she was speaking of, one, I quote, simply takes minimal structures that are universal. And then ideas come, and out of ideas I get my methods into that specific process of going to an architectural solution. So I simply make this observation that even there, when we would assume that people are very spontaneously going into their architectural work, or where they would invent beyond any specific context or any specific visible theoretical background, they would apply to such models as using universals or finding analogies or searching for a method which is more than actual causal. So what else than showing or pointing to those examples in order to illustrate or to introduce what our aim is, illustrating some historically provable attempts of making architecture be something more than a mere building activity, a method of thinking toward a systematic approach of architecture. And this would give us or allow us to speak about architectural science. And I will today try to use two different historical contexts who might illustrate this particular process. Naturally, I do not believe that this is the only process which happened within architectural history. So I had the chance to give a few words on that little, not blackboard, but whiteboard, and you see just right on the right half of it that I gave an indication about the two historical frameworks I will use in order to illustrate what I'm going to do. The first is actually a very remote history, but it is the essential time when architecture in, let's say, we say modern times, but naturally from LA, that's prehistoric time, when architecture first started to go into a systematic field or a systematic context. And the occasion was somehow the rediscovery of a text, the text of Vitruvius, which you might know, that's the only ancient, more or less systematic, but mainly complete text on architectural problems. It was rediscovered and gave occasion to many attempts to read it, to understand it, to let it appear a scientific body of knowledge. I'm going into that context, and this context somehow ends when the, let's say, the best Vitruvian comments were written by Daniele Barbaro, who used the drawings of Palladio, as you know. So this whole period was somehow concluded, if you want, in late 16th century. This is the one historical context I use. I try to introduce it in order to avoid too many historical data in my later explanations. The second context is a modern context. It's a context of Le Corbusier. And you will easily understand that I try naturally to say that Corbusier handles problems in a very similar way, that he is very aware about architecture being based on universals, that he's very aware that systematics is useful in handling this architectural invention. Now, the main topic behind all those historical or the main thesis I try to expose here is that in order to find or to define architectural science, people or historians, theoreticians would find out that the drawing is the specific architectural language which is suitable to be transformed or to used as specifically architectural scientific language. And I will not explain that very scholarly as I would have to do it, but I introduce it simply as a thesis. And I have still as an introduction to speak about some conditions which bring architecture, being a practice of building processes, into that situation to be able to be formed as a science. And I named there three keywords. The first is autonomy, the second is institution, and the third is science. As to autonomy, I should simply say that it is quite clear that throughout medieval practice, architecture is mainly a building practice. The builder is the guy who builds up a house, a cathedral, by piling up stones, whatever. He is skillful, he has some receipts how to deal with it, but there is no evidence that it should form a science. When it comes to scientific descriptions or scientific quotations, we probably have to find them through a theologue or a philosopher or a mathematician who makes comments on it or makes more general observations. But those two things did not yet come together. So we could observe that within that process, architecture moving up to architectural science, it is a necessary event that it finds its own autonomy. And I give, in order to illustrate this very complex story, naturally, I give you a small anecdote. The anecdote is out from the major late antique book on, let's say, the sciences. You might have heard about the 7 liberal arts. The seven liberal arts is simply a code of lining up or summing up the different sciences which were accepted as being sciences. And the most known late antique text on those liberal arts was written by Marcianus Capella. You can forget that name immediately afterwards, but it is a very interesting and illustrative text. It is describing a supper upstairs in the Olympicus, and you see all the gods and goddesses. That can be a Hollywood story, could be. And Apollo and Athena and the other gods come together and say, now let us have this invitation. Let's have the arts and the sciences. And they discuss naturally whom to invite. And not everybody is agreeing whom actually they should invite. So geometry appears, astronomy appears, and so on, all the 7 liberal arts. And as Apollo tries to favor a little bit more the arts, he tries to get in or get in architecture too. And the gods decide not to accept this proposal and give an explanation. And this explanation says, architecture has dirty hands. We have to refuse it or him or her, whatever, as it is not a science. It is a practice. It is an application of a science. So this text does show up and make clear what the difference is between artes liberales, liberal arts, and mechanical arts, artes mechanicae. And it says clearly that architecture is a mechanical art and does not belong to the liberal arts, is not a science. Now, I introduced this anecdote in order to show how it was, or how the hierarchy of different human activities was up to that moment when Vitruvius is rediscovered and is taken serious. Vitruvius says in his first phrase, architecture is a science. So obviously we have to found ourselves exposed to a contradiction. And this contradiction is accepted very well, and people like to accept this contradiction when one is defending the architecture. So Vitruvius, being the authority, being the only ancient text on architecture, gives sufficient grounds to deal with architecture possibly being a science of its own, or possibly becoming an autonomous science, or simply getting until a status of being autonomous. And naturally, Vitruvius explains it, and Vitruvius says, just opposed to Marcianus Capella or the classical code of the 7 liberal arts, he says, architecture is a science composed of different other sciences, or if you put up hierarchies, we have now architecture on the top, and philosophy, medicine, mathematics, and all the other sciences helping architecture or sustaining architecture. So if you would put that in a schematic diagram, we have just the opposed system or the opposed scheme which is now being introduced, or which is now a new base to handle architectural problems in a scientific way. Naturally, you know about what it is with theories. They are tautological in that sense. Once you believe such a thing, you will have sufficient reasons to prove what is introduced as a hypothesis. So we have simply to deal with that thesis that architecture throughout the 15th and 16th century gets into that state of being more and more autonomous. And you would naturally ask, who is giving the guarantees, who is helping architecture being autonomous? Naturally, we should now speak about the different theoreticians, whatever, but we should think about the more general problem too of the necessary institutional framework. You know about academies, and I will not go into that particular problem here. Academies are in that very early phase very rare, even if we know that one of the academies founded in Rome in the 1530s was especially dealing with Vitruvius and preparing the scientific, far most elaborated Vitruvian edition, actually this Accademia di Virtù, founded by Claudio Tolomei. We know that in later times the French Architectural Academy was essentially helping architecture being an autonomous science, there's no doubt, but academies are not guaranteed in their existence. They do happen, and they may help architecture in its way to get autonomy. However, I have to introduce it as, let's say, as one of the frameworks we have to acknowledge. Third is much more important. I put the science, but I should have written theory. What is much more important, that once you plea for autonomy, you have to prove it. And you can prove it only if you fulfill the expectations you could have by asking or looking to what normally is described or defined as science. Now, again, Vitruvius says exactly what he would like to be understood as science, and he's very clear about it when he says architecture is a science formed by theory and practice. And he makes long comments about the double relationship. Science with theory without praxis is nothing, or it doesn't work out, and opposite, praxis without theory is useless. So Vitruvius introduced very, very clearly that new double life of architecture, being at the time a practice which comes out of theoretical observations and vice versa. At that time, I simplify very much, you must know that, but I should say that Vitruvius uses the word science twice. He uses it in the first phrase of the first book in giving a definition of architecture, and the second time when he incidentally speaks about drawing. Now, I cannot tell you that this has been really understood being an important issue. Even Daniele Barbaro, who is the most eloquent commenting person of Vitruvius, does not really use it in order to associate drawing directly with science. But it is true, Vitruvius used it twice, and it was at least a sufficient indication that that drawing could be somehow involved in that process of finding a concrete answer to what theory within architecture should be, or what specifically theory within architecture could mean. As to that, I should give you a few theoretical introductions again. The word that Vitruvius uses for theory is ratiocinatio. I'm sorry, it's Latin, but I'm not the first guy using Latin words in LA. Anyway, and I have to do it as it simply is not equivalent to our more modern or more recent use of the word theory. Ratiocinatio would have to be translated in our days the use of rational means, or is pointing to the specific function of your brain, which is rationalization. And it meant in that time specifically the syllogism. This is the operation, the mental operation of deducing something. it is in those times understood in a scholastic tradition, and scholastic tradition meant by ratiocinatio or by deduction, having some premises and create out of them something new. This is very important to know, as we will see, or we should just introduce it right now, that Euclidean definitions are quite similar, or I would even say are identical. Euclidean systematics was considered being the most systematic of the time and being specifically of the nature of deducing. So our deduction or our syllogism is very simple. It says that if you combine Vitruvius with Euclid, you will have the right choice of making architecture being a science. Or the other way around, if you use the device of Euclidean geometry, giving you a practical hint of how to deduce and to find out something new, you would be able to give a definition of what Vitruvius might have meant when he spoke about gravitas scientia. This is actually what came out of that whole philological study I did sometimes long in long nights in the winter, sometimes in the north. This is the thesis I operate with. Gravitas scientia is the occasion to combine drawing with science. Euclid is the synonymous explanation of what could be systematic within Vitruvian theory, and the words, the identity of the terms, are sufficiently eloquent to allow such explanations. Now, sufficient with theoretical introduction. I start now with slides, and it might become a little bit more practical and less theoretical, even if with Vitruv I believe naturally about the identity of those two. It is clear that Vitruvius, in giving authority to his theory, or better, that all who make explanations or comments on Vitruvius in order to give authority to the Vitruvian knowledge, use historical framework too. That's again something which is provocating me. I mean, I was just today passing some downtown in Los Angeles, and you can find inscriptions which seem to be very old, and they are in metal, and it's written founded in 1902. It's not founded in 500 and something like that. It's founded in 1902. If this would be happened many hundreds of years ago. But anyway, at that time, you would still allow yourself to go back to the first human beings in order to give historical authority to any of your little tales you had to tell. Now, we know the Vitruvian text is very chaotic. People knew always about it. It has a series of little tales which introduce some other general problems about architecture. And can we now switch out a little bit the lights? And I'm sure you have all somehow knowledge about the history of the primitive hut as being the history of the foundation of architecture. It would be a simplistic reading if you look to it only in terms of the event of how to get to architecture. If you look closer to it and to the explanation Vitruvius gets, we will see that there is within this history a quite remarkably sophisticated theory, or a quite sophisticated model of the evolution of human mankind, or of human culture or human cultural tools. So what is this story about? The story begins with a fire. Something happens without, this Vitruvius is very clear about, without the human intervention. The fire is simply occurring. But it has an effect on human beings. Human beings occur and they feel something. They feel the positive effect. It is warming up. And this is a common interest. That's a usual paradigm of defining how society gets together. It's identical when you read Aristotle or Plato about how cities grew up. A common interest is being discovered, and the common interest shares people together, makes group, forms society, and creates different or new or supplementary needs. So after first society is born, people discover that they should somehow communicate amongst themselves, and they invent language. I just say right now, language, using language or communicating is given in Latin sometimes by that same word which is ratiocinare, using your brain. It's not simply saying words or giving a line of words which start with Coca-Cola and ends with something else. It is a systematic use of language. This is only how to justify communication. So second is the foundation of language, which is the same word as is used for the use of drawing within architecture. And only then came up supplementary needs, such as the protections against beasts, against rain, climate, and so on. And then architecture came in. So the history of primitive hut is not only the first building process this being described, but it is a model of the evolution of human activities, which start with the society itself, the communicative function within society, and only then architecture as giving supplementary models or supplementary helps, and you know how it is introduced, first through necessity, then by usefulness, and finally by aesthetic values. Now, at this point, I have to give you a second tale or second anecdote out of Vitruvius. This time, he speaks about a Greek philosopher whose name is Aristipp, and that philosopher went on with a boat in the sea and came into a storm, and the ship was destroyed, and this philosopher somehow came onto an island, and he stand up and walked around looking, trying to discover where he came to be on that earth. And he finds these little schemes. I should try to focus that a little bit. Oh, sorry. Is there any computer around to focus that? Fantastic, yes. So Aristipp finds these signs, and as he is a philosopher, what means he can use his brain, he is aware of what ratiocinare is, he makes a conclusion out of this observation, and the conclusion reads, vestigia hominum video, I see traces of human beings. And this little tale found many interested people, and gave occasion to many specific explanation of it, and mainly Daniele Barbaro, whom I introduce again as being the guy who did this probably best or most scientific comment to Vitruvius in 1556, the guy who used Palladio's drawings for his edition. He points actually to the fact that it does not only mean that Aristippus is happy to be amongst other human beings again, but that here Vitruvius gives a tale about the capacity of human beings, specific capacities as opposed to animalia bruta, to beasts. And through all these considerations, Barbaro will claim that actually geometric figures, geometric schemes are specifically produced by this living natures who actually can use that function of ratiocinare. So again, you see, it's a closed circle. about describing mental capacities equally to theoretical interest and the process of using geometric devices. This tale is quite important for that particular, what should I say, identification of moving theoretically within architecture and using geometry as that specific language. I guess I explained that now sufficiently. I could naturally go into details and tell you at least that little story about Girolamo Cardano, which is a far most important mathematician of the first half of 16th century, the author of one of those humanistic encyclopedias, who gives a list of the 12 most important people he believes to have helped in different fields of sciences. And amongst those 12, he lines up Vitruvius and Euclid. And he would say about Vitruvius that naturally he is very important, as he did not only give us the information about architecture, and the only information without which we would not be aware about architecture as a whole, and even more about mechanics, and so on, and so on, and so on. But he says Vitruvius would be even much more important if he would written down his things a little bit more systematically and less chaotic. And the comment to Euclid reads quite different. It reads that Euclid is the guy who did the most systematic, the most systematic of all potential sciences. So you can understand that if you had such tales about Aristipp, geometry and language, geometry, rationale being the same word for theory in architecture, all this brings it together that you could easily match, or that you easily could find out that that in order to prove architecture being theoretically valid, you have to get into geometrics and use for it, and look for it. Now, again, I have to look to that historical context. Naturally, things are always difficult. And as this Vitruvian text was rediscovered in 1415, it was naturally not rediscovered in a nice shape, as nowadays when we go to a bookshop. But it was without illustrations, even if we know that Vitruvius wrote by himself that he announced that he would give illustrations. So people were puzzled, and they said, well, he told that he made illustrations, but where are they, how were they, and so on. So one of the philological requests was actually to reconstruct that part of the Vitruvian theory which was consisting in drawings, and amongst other requests, such as to define the terminology and to match the Greek with the Latin in this very chaotic text. Only a few figures or illustrations were known through some of the medieval copies of these Vitruvian texts. You know that many of these texts were copied out, and the oldest one at the time, the oldest which we know, is of Carolingian time, of the early 9th century. But anyway, the few illustrations which were known were purely mathematical, such as the one which I show you on the left-hand slide. So again, this was a kind of empirical hint that the illustrations would all be somehow reduced to an abstract mathematical geometrical language. Furthermore, it is clear that in the whole tradition, not only of architecture but of philosophy, that geometric schemes were always used for mental operations, for I should say codifying pictures. On your right-hand side, you see one page of the very famous sketchbook of Villard de Honnecourt, one of the best known and the most important, by far most important medieval treatise of architecture, if you want. It's not very correct what I'm saying, but it's essential to see that there is a tradition in matching very irregular shapes, I should say, out of the arts with geometric figures in order to give to it some kind of more systematic figure. So, again, I point to that problem of specificity of architectural theoretical interests which match exactly with Euclid. Once we go into the whole tradition of treatises, we will see immediately that Euclid is integrated. I could go now to the late Gothic, the first published versions of Säulenbücher, as they call it, and they are naturally reduced to some geometric figures, or they show how very sophisticated Gothic forms are reduced to or brought back to their geometric device. And we should now, in our analysis, start with such observations, but go ahead and look how that starting point of Euclidean geometry is used in order to respond to the far more complicated, the far more specific language, potential language of architecture, its use, actually, its codification, its notation, its codification, its being used for specific architectural processes. And you can see how easily this works out immediately at that time. On your left-hand side, you see one page out of Serlio's treatise. Serlio is one of the first who uses systematically the possibility of reproduce architectural figures using the xylography and even the engraving. And you can see that he lines up following Euclidean schematics, single forms. Naturally, he starts with a pointer line and so on, and comes up to some of the very easy or the very universal geometric schemes. If I point to that one here, just to give an example, this is a classical, I should say, a classical combination of geometric figures, square, circle, square, circle. For that we could find easy medieval tradition. It is simply one of the foremost used geometric configuration from which you could start to make up very complicated plans or whatever. But I'm not pointing to that. I'm pointing to the slide on your right hand, on your right, which is taken from Palladio, and you see how immediately the shift can occur between the pure lining up of the geometric device and the use or the interpretation within architectural needs. On the right-hand side, the scheme is the geometric figures are used to define plans of specific rooms within a villa or whatever. So there's no problem. There's an easy shift from the abstract use of theory and the mix up with your practical needs. This is very important for all of our next observations. I could now give you a series of slides. I have a few with me just to see that. For instance, such figures, you see it on the right on the title page of Viollet-le-Duc in 19th century. You see it on your left-hand page out of Palladio again, just in order to illustrate some proportions for your the spaces inside a house, relation between ground plan and altitude. Or naturally, you could go to any of those easy analogies. Left-hand side, a representation which is both qualitatively and quantitatively defining bodies, shapes, whatever. These drawings go back. I mean, we could build up traditions of such representation back to Psellus, a Byzantine mathematician, and so on and so on. And you see how easy it is to compare it with a plan by Mies van der Rohe. This comparison naturally doesn't tell very much unless it says that geometry is universal within these purposes. But the universality is sufficient and has to be put on first before we go into more detailed arguments, and so on and so on. The modulor naturally goes within this tradition, as does one of the drawings by Peter Eisenman and many other examples I could give you. Anyway, you can see this kind of tradition matching more or less immediately geometric figures with potential figures for architectural needs are very easily being demonstrated. What is important in that is that we make distinctions between what actually the capacity of abstraction gives to you and what through it is naturally of scientific value, where the universality of geometry is to be observed, where are the limits of it, and what actually it means for our purpose of looking to a scientific historical background. So it is clear, if I take Brunelleschi's Cappella Pazzi and an Aldo Rossi window, you can easily compare and see there is a similar or an identical, if you want, geometric device, which makes it beyond history being on the same level, let's say, of a specific use of specific architectural instrument. And beyond that, naturally, you will find within Brunelleschi many elements which you have exclusively to explain or to understand by looking to the particular historical context, such as the mimetic device, the use of the orders, the specific quotation from antique decoration piece, that sarcophagus element, and so on and so on. But it is clear we could easily, too easily, build up beyond any historical device traditions of architecture which are based on that universal geometric language. That's some wood. I'm reappearing. Now you must have understood that I try to say more is needed. We cannot simply, even not with Corbusier, speak about la géométrie, le seul langage que nous sachions parler. Geometry being the only language which we architects could really speak. It is not sufficient. It is not yet instrumental. So we have to look closer to how, in Vitruvian times or later, architects would try to go into that particular affair. And I have to introduce here the notion of figure. The notion of figure is actually more. The notion of figure is explained exactly in those times again as being something which you deduce from geometric devices and is something which is new. So you simply, to make it very banal, you simply use geometric elements and you match them in order to create figures. And those figures can already be specifically architectural. By the way, it is important that it matches. And again, they are the same words being used by the mathematicians of the time of Daniele Barbaro and elsewhere. It is important to look at it. And you should know too that naturally the word figure in Greek means typos, and that we are close, I say, to the word of typology once we speak about figures, or the other way around. It is very banal to make theoretical foundations of typology, looking to what figure typos really meant to be. But I introduced this example just to illustrate a little bit how it happens, how it occurs. And it is not casual that people now in that particular historical moment try to define any artifact or different artifacts through that same method of using that universal language, which is geometry, explained, made explicit in these drawn up lines in order to define, for instance, the letters of alphabet, or let's say the letters of architecture, which is a capital. People were very much aware that there are analogies in this process of figure making. And it was simply important to see and to elaborate that capacity. It's not to elaborate the capacity of geometry, it's elaborate the capacity of using geometry in order to define architectural figures. And we could easily understand that whole process, this ongoing process of making architecture or of discussing architectural theory through the 16th, 17th, 18th century by using to the development of complexities within architectural figures and more of that. These were just two images to illustrate a little bit of the symbolic value of figures. Figures have by themselves a very old tradition in that particular sense. I mean, there's at left again a Greek philosopher who becomes important through the symbol of his figure, of his architectural, of his mathematical invention. But I'd like to make this comparison, for instance. Again, one of these constructions out of geometry of a letter, giving a figure of a letter of an alphabet, and on the right-hand side, the very similarly produced figure of a new architecture done by van Doesburg and van Esteren for that famous De Stijl exhibition in Paris, 1923. They are similar in the way they are produced through that particular use of geometry, and the result is similar actually in being a figure. We could in this particular occasion discuss about the two-dimensional and the three-dimensional, and if you want the fourth-dimensional definition of such figures. But anyway, the figure is the result which is at the time still theoretical, if you want, but is a concrete architectural device. I have a few more examples to give you illustrations about the importance of architectural figures. Vitruvius by himself defines, now I should say, typologies through giving geometric, mathematical descriptions of figures. The most known example is the example of the ancient theater, which is defined only exclusively through this polygonal star. And afterwards, naturally, through knowledge of concrete rests of ancient theaters, archaeologues or Vitruvians are going to make reconstructions out of it. But the essential of that figure is defined through the pure geometry. And I add, that's a little bit rhetorically what I do. It's not so scientifically as it should be. But even in such works, which are always described as being so totally capricious, as they are Rococo or Baroque or whatever. That's a photograph from the Piazza Sant'Ignazio in Rome. It shows you clearly that even in complex architectural works, figures can be rediscovered through the planning by which they are introduced in a project, for instance. So it is very easy to make photographs of that kind in order to get out the underlying geometric device, actually the figure which is making that particular project. Well, I could go on with that, and I introduce now another thing which is important. In order to be able to make those figures become more elaborate, you naturally have to look to your tools. And the tools are those tools by which you make your geometric drawings. And it is again quite clear that with the sophisticated use of your tools, you get the more sophisticated or more complex figure to produce architecture or architectural designs. These are only a few examples. And what is most important, that by handling all those issues together somehow, you can easily define, or you could find a posteriori what really architectural drawing means. Architectural drawing is defined by Vitruvius. He gives, that's again to last Monday's lecture, a little connection with it. Vitruvius uses the Greek word of idea, and this is the overall notion for what the drawing is. So you can again imagine how large this notion is. It goes from the very abstract to the very concrete. And naturally, he then tells that you have different kinds of drawing. But we instead of going into that very complicated discussion how it can be explained at that time, I go simply in this particular case where I would say architectural drawing is quite scientifically, clearly defined within the drawings that Palladio did first for the Vitruvian edition of Daniele Barbaro and later for his own Quattro Libri. And the drawing, which is a xylography, a woodcut, is very typical for that definition, for this, not definition, for the practical, for the concrete way architectural drawings look. You can see that the drawing is very abstract. It is reduced to geometric elements. You cannot see any element which is drawn by freehand, I guess we would say today. And for this, I make only a few comments. Once you find out something, you have to prove it. And if you cannot prove it, you simply find out something else. So you try it with terminology, for instance. And we know clearly that in that time, people were very sophisticated and knew naturally that the painter, the sculptor, was drawing too. But he was not scientifically drawing. He was not drawing by using geometry. And so they went, humanists went to the point to say, we have to have different terms in Latin and Greek to say what the architect does and what the painter does. And so they found even out new Greek words such as grammike for the architectural, purely geometrical drawing, and graphike for the drawing of a painter. Anyway, it's important to see that now with Palladio, to give naturally, before that I could see, but I just choose Palladio as it is very clear that with him this idea of a scientific drawing is clearly introduced. It is reduced to geometric lines. They are equally drawn. You don't see thick lines and less thick lines, but it's a uniform line. Why? Geometry tells, Euclides defines to you the line to be the shortest distance between 2 points. It means it has no extension. And just in order to make it perceptible, you give it a specific extension, which is abstract in those terms that is always the same. So you can see it is an abstract drawing. Second observation, anything which is, let's say, a reference, which points to historical context or points to any quantitative thing, is introduced in the drawing only through reference in terms of an A or a B or whatever. And the A and B refers to the text of the site before, where Palladio then would say, yes, this temple stands there in this little town and whatever. So I point to that just to say, or to, yes, to make it brief, to say very clearly that between the appearance of Vitruvius, of which I told you that it appeared without the figures, it was a textbook, and the Palladian time, when the illustrations are really autonomous and are sufficient informations to let you understand architecture. There's an incredible development. Only the footnotes are now somehow in the text, and all what is essential for your architectural interest is within the drawing. This happens throughout this whole development, and I have simply to put it. This is what Alberti, for instance, says is lineamenta. This is geometric drawing, and it can be handled scientifically, as it does follow actually the scientific systematic approach by Euclideus. Now, I guess I should go on and now say how one gets into this specific task of making architecture out of it by developing figures, more complete, more complex figures who match the particular purpose of your architectural problem. And I would simply introduce here two, I should say, criteria of what scientific then really means. The first is notation or codification. The second will be systematics. And I give you a few examples of that very early state of a discussion. The first examples refer to the first illustrated edition of Vitruvius by Fra Giocondo in 1511. And I use it to give you an example of how systematically this thinking was really adopted. Vitruvius gives, amongst other, the whole series of different types of temples. And naturally you could go around and make nice drawings of them and publish them simply. Or you could measure it up and produce it. But it's quite clear that this was not the purpose in these drawings. These drawings are systematic in order to get out of Vitruvius what is important to define those typologies of different temples, or to distinguish them between themselves. So this formula of drawing can easily go into a computer. You could simply say all temples are figures made out of little circles for columns and lines for walls. It's a very simple codification of architectural figures or typologies. And as you can see, you can match with all the complicated descriptions that Vitruvius gives to you. Left are the temples, right-hand side are more particular and more complex typologies described by Vitruvius, such as the basilica and more of those examples. But you can see the language, if you want to say, or simply the geometric drawing is always the same. So there it is, how you handle it. And again, I want to give you, this time I want to compare with a build example. Left-hand side, you have one of those Vitruvian figures, definition of theater through a geometric device. And on your right-hand side, you have the Rocca Pisana, built by Scamozzi, which is now explained, or if you want, justified a posteriori through its geometric device. So the system is tautological, you know. And here, at least, I should add an observation which is quite important. A further meaning or a further translation of the word theory, ratiocinatio, syllogism, is discorso or discours in French, which means communication or means communicating. Some of the first Italian and French translation of that particular word pointed out that discorso would be synonymous more as any other word. And you can now see, and you would find the correspondence within Vitruvian's explanation of theory. It does not only, this figure that does not only give you a possibility of making your figure for a theater, but it explains your project through that particular figure when it is built. So a posteriori, a priori relations are equally possible and can be used for it. And as well, you can see in this scheme how easily you can go from simple figures to more complex figures, as long as you find that this, I say now, this science is potentially being applied to it. Again, I point to one of these examples which can have very banal explanation, saying simply that these two things are analogous. They are both somehow columns with a base with different elements, but that's not the point. The point is that similar use of architectural figure can be used in order to define your specific architectural project. But anyhow, once we have that knowledge, or once we can simply understand and have more than a mimetic idea about historical continuity. As far as to the problem of notation or codification, and I should go just very quickly to the problem of systematics. Systematics is a little bit more. It means that this whole theoretical body is somehow continuous, and within this, the attempt of the Vitruvian theory to define drawing, we have a particular case where it becomes very obvious what the advantage was of making this problem systematic. I said that Vitruvius defines the drawing in the Greek terms of idea, and he gives three kinds of, which in Latin, spells ichnographia, orthographia, and schiographia. But some read scenographia, and there is a big process going on in giving the right philological explanation of it. Today we know that Vitruvius clearly meant perspective drawing, scenographia, but some clever guy at the time said it would be more systematic if we took it as schiographia. Why? I tell that you very quickly. These are the illustrations out of Cesariano's comment. That's the first Italian edition of 1521 in Como, which gives you ichnographia, the plan, orthographia, which is not clear, it's more a section than an elevation, and finally, finally, a very complex figure which up to this date has never been, I'm sorry to say, never been correctly given an interpretation, as it tries to be a very literal translation of what Vitruvius gives for that third figure, scenographia or schiographia, of which Cesariano got out that it should somehow reassemble different figures, and that the lines of all those points should go into one point. But we know today that it should be given an interpretation as to the Albertian or Brunelleschian perspective, more or less. But Cesariano was not able, and he gives this very complex, you can say medieval, very not easy understandable figure. So that was the point at that time. But actually now, and it was still the point with Fra Giocondo, who gives clearly ichnographia, plan, orthographia, elevation, and he gives scenographia, scenography. And you can see where the problem is. Those three different figures, or if you want, those three different forms of architectural drawings are not systematic, as you cannot compare them on the same level. The geometric figure, the perspective figure gives you wrong measures, is not geometrically pure in that sense, so it does not really help the drawing being scientific or being actually what it is meant to be, the science, damned, this lady. Here it is. Now, actually, Daniele Barbaro, we know already Raphael had this problem, whatever, but in the Daniele Barbaro edition, this problem is now resolved. Instead of having ichnographia, sciographia, scenographia, you have ichnographia, orthographia, and schiographia. So schiographia was a total new invention. This word doesn't exist in Latin, and it was somehow derived by Schio means shadow, and graphia, the painting, the lining up of a shadow, which could mean profile, which is section, a whole philological construction, which had the advantage of matching. So you see, Barber gives only one figure for orthographia and schiographia. They can be immediately be compared. They are within the same geometric scientific language. It's a pure fictitious, if you want, fictitious construction of a science which was not meant in that way by Vitruvius, but actually that was the humanistic interest in order to get architecture to that point of being autonomous, of having its own scientific language, of having this language very, very systematic. At that time, I finish with my historical part, and I make something very, very curious. I switch over to a modern context and go into Corbusier, who is very much misunderstood, as most is always misunderstood, that's as it is. And we still live in a period when many people believe that modern architecture was brought up against history and so on and so on. And again, people rarely make this distinction between what they did not like and what they really liked. And it is very clear in Corbusier that he had a specific interest in history, and I would now say, simplifying very much, that Corbusier is on that Vitruvian line, which looks for the scientific, universal, in architectural theory, and is against the abuse or misuse of history in terms of mimetic application of history. So you must know, I suppose, at least one ancient book, which is the book of Vignola, Regola degli Cinque Ordini, which was one of the first books who renounced to deal with the total text of Vitruvius, but took out a part of it, namely the 5 orders, telling people, well, it is sufficient to know about those few rules in order to be able to do as the ancients did, building temples and so on. That's probably still here in Beverly Hills. I mean, you can with these columns make nice little houses, I'm sure, no doubt. But there are different approaches to antiquity, different approaches to history. At your right, you see this nice drawing by Corbusier, which says, "Et Vignol enfin est foutu, merci victoire." So he says clearly, I am against Vignola, but he doesn't say that he's against history. And the next 2 slides explain that a little bit better. On your left-hand side, some drawings of windows of temples with crossed through. Ceci n'est pas l'architecture, ce sont les styles. He's against styles in terms of mimetic appearances throughout history of classical and other architecture. But, as the right-hand slide says, he has a big admiration for all those who used that particular ancient device for going into a scientific, systematic dealing with architecture. It is quite cute. I mean, one would not expect that a modernist like Corbusier would be able to make distinction between, let's say, Vignola and Serlio and Fra Gioconda and Daniele Barbaro, but obviously he does. He uses the illustration of the first French Vitruvian edition by Jean Martin, who by himself was based very much on Fra Gioconda, and who, by the way, was member of the Vitruvian Academy in the 30s of the 16th century in Rome. So without any doubt, he was a tough guy, he was a scientific guy, he had the direct contact with those interests at the time. He shared those interests, the interest I was trying to explain a little bit historically. So this to introduce that Corbusier has a very selective attitude towards history and towards architecture being or having its scientific or systematic grounds. I'm now choosing a few things to give at least an indication how I could conceive that we could understand Corbusier by looking to that kind of problem. What is well known is that Corbusier dealt with a few, let's say, classic topics of architectural history. I would say these are perhaps the more superficial. The Homo Vitruvianus naturally is important or is at the base of the modular, but I'm not going into that. I can only tell you that little story that naturally Corbusier, as other ones, are not very honest about the sources they use and the books they read. And when Corbusier introduces the modular, he speaks about a night in a Paris hotel with a candlelight and a few photographs, postcards, and he drew lines on those postcards, and he discovered the correct proportions on those buildings that he had on the postcards. But naturally, many years before that night and candlelight, and I don't know what was it, cognac or whatever he drank, he had knowledge about this tradition of handling proportions, handling in the way that it could be matched, that it could match with the problem of figures and making figures of architecture. So for the moment, I'm not going into that, which is probably well known and much better known than anything else. Nor does I go into that problem about the primary forms. The primary forms being quite clearly related to what the universals of geometry are. And naturally, you know about that Duperrac plan of Rome and Corbusier's interpretation of reducing all that architectural stuff into the geometric bodies. Anyway, here again, this is a process of reduction which is quite simple. I'm going now into another theme which is less known, and I wanted to speak about that part. I will be very short. That part which is known very well with the title of the 5 points. 5 points, which is probably the most systematic little text that Corbusier has ever done in terms of theory. And we know that he casually published it when he was invited to take part to the Weissenhof-Siedlung in Stuttgart, and Alfred Roth was publishing his book, and Corbusier had to send in a text, so he sent it in and wrote these 5 points down, which he later took up again and changed and so on and so on. But anyway, the 5 points are very famous, by the way, and they are sometimes and very often misread as being a manifesto how modern architecture looks like, instead of looking what could be the theoretical basis of handling architecture in a new modern condition. Anyway, before I go to that point, I have to go back to that particular problem, which is very much influencing the 5 points, namely the whole discussion about the tracé régulateur. All those, what we should translate, the regulating traces, whatever. This kind of lines laid over buildings which then form nice proportions. The lines match on right angles. And we know about that whole problem being very, very popular, very well known in late 19th century, namely the German architect Tirsch became famous through developing it, and he, a right German, makes a Lex Tirschiana. He found the Tirschian law, and this was very much studied. For instance, at the time when the young Corbusier went to Germany in 1910-11, and you will find the same schemes in Architectur as you will find them within art historical analysis of Heinrich Wölflin and so on. And we know that Corbusier very early went into that matter and used it to illustrate his Villa Schwob, one of his first villas, which he still did in La Chaux-de-Fonds in Switzerland. Now, what I'm pointing at is not so much a description how it worked out, but I have to go I'm going to the text which Corbusier wrote down in order to explain his way or his reasons why he actually used these traces régulateurs. And what is so astonishing about this explanation, that we will actually find very similar ideas or very similar kinds of explanations than the Vitruvian explanation I introduced to you some minutes ago. I give you I give you a few words out of that. He naturally says, he says there are two main aims of these traces régulateurs. We can go to the next slides too. The first is correction. Correction, it is a control against the arbitrarian figures or architecture, should we say. So naturally, geometry, Euclidean geometry is always a means of controlling that things are correct in your design or in your drawing. So that's the first, if you want, negative explanation of it. The second is, that's very curious, Corbusier speaks about satisfaction, satisfaction. And he says two things. It's a satisfaction of your artistic sense, sens artistique, so that's an aesthetic quality. And second, it's a satisfaction d'ordre de la pensée mathématique, of your mathematical mind. So it's very interesting to see that he knows exactly about the relationship or the matching of aesthetics and mathematics, and with other words, that is going back to that, if you want, naturally, to the ideology of the universes of geometry, being that base on which you build up your architecture, or on which base you figure out architecture, make your drawings, and so on. Other words he uses are opération de vérification and satisfaction d'ordre spirituel. It is a satisfaction of a spiritual order. And he says, and here finally it becomes clearly Vitruvian, he says, this ordre spirituel, this spiritual order, creates eurythmy. Eurythmy, I don't know how to pronounce it in English. Written down, it probably still exists in that language, but it is the old Greek word to define a good rhythm, or if you want, actually a good figure. So eurythmy, we know, is a word which is introduced in that whole architectural business through Vitruvius, and it is one of the words which is scarcely or rarely used. So it is quite surprising that Corbusier, by pointing out those things, is so precise in choosing these particular words. The same is now true for the 5 points. Quickly go back. Naturally, we know about how these figures were operating. These figures, in terms of the traces régulateurs, were equally going to define the facades, let's say, or let's say the orthographia. It's very curious to see that, let's say, that compared with Adolf Loos and Raumplan and the dealing with third dimensions, Corbusier is very clearly using the, let's say, Vitruvian tradition of using plan, elevation, section, if you want. And even if he's naturally going, and some critique, like Gideon describes the traces régulateurs as being then developed to the point to be used in a third dimension. It is clear that on those grounds we can go back, and as we could look to Euclidean figures and Palladian explanations, we can go back to Euclidean figures out of Francesco di Giorgio Martini and put it next to the Pavillon de l'Esprit Nouveau, or put it, sorry, I'm now mixed up, obviously. There's no universal of using slides. Esprit Nouveau, or putting next to a sketch of Mondrian. Naturally, again, in modern times, the universal use of geometry is available, and or the other way around, the same problem is to be viewed at, or we have to make analysis of the same problem. How can geometry be transferred into concrete architectural working through building up of figures, through making those figures respond more directly or more concretely with your architectural problems? So we could say we should look again to notation, codification, to systematics within Le Corbusier, and I can make that very quickly in order to finish not too late. It is very interesting to look at those texts written by Corbusier himself and by Amédée Ozenfant, of whom you know that he worked together with Corbusier, and they have knowledge about having to go back and to refound let's say the systematic or scientific way of building up on Euclidean grounds. So Ozenfant speaks about constante de sensations et des formes éléments dans la nature et dans l'art. He knows, or he defines geometric universal as being constant grounds on which form out architecture. And to give you only a few slides, the slide right is just one of many of that kind, which similar to the Euclidean lining up of simple to complex figures, lines up those geometric figures, comes up to rectilinear language, to curvilinear modes, and this fills up or completes a whole grammar of how to, by which you can define any of the most complex figures that you need. It is very, this analogy or whatever, this comparison by Corbusier between the Greek temple and the modern car is very famous. And again, it is misunderstood. It is misunderstood in terms of modernity against ancient or whatever, or that the car has finally reached the value of the Greek temple. That's not the problem in it. The problem is that it goes back to that universal codification by which equally the Greek temple and the modern car can be reached. He speaks in this particular context about standard. It's not standardization in terms of reducing a product to its the necessity of its productive modes, as would, for instance, some of the Bauhaus do it more than Corbusier, and you know about this whole polemic between Corbusier and Karl Teige and so on. Corbusier has a very humanistic understanding of that problem, and he's proving the machine being as virtually cultural important as is the Greek temple, but through that common notation, if you want, or that common language in architectural geometric drawing. Or, as to notation, another example, how they dealt with history, Ozenfant and Corbusier. They went naturally to Greece, they went to Versailles and so on, and they discover or they find their specific historical instances. But their observation, again, is an observation which is reducing objects to their geometric value, or to their figure value, if you want, or even more, to their drawing quality. So, the Greek sculpture is here explained or presented as verticalité. That's a historical instance of the vertical figure, or vertical lines. And the steps of Versailles are given an interpretation of horizontalité. There's no interest of looking to it as the steps of Versailles, a good example to be imitated, whatever. But it is immediately reduced to that level where you can handle things systematically. And so, similar as Vitruvius always uses also historical devices in order to give more authority to his thinking, Ozenfant does the same. He finds this section of a plant and discovers in it not only the miracle of nature, but he discovers the Doric nature of nature. Means that he can make abstraction from the specific object and ally it somehow with that geometric character. And so it goes on. Quand la nature est ionique, he founds these volutes within nature, and it is out of a famous book of the time by Blossfeld, who was very famous for getting this marvelous first microphotographs, whatever, of those details, but also for discovered it as fitting into his ideas or his interest, and defined through it that the architectural foundation of specific figures are more general than the nature itself, to say. And now you understand why I use these examples in order to introduce the codification. It is through that, on the base of such language techniques, if you want, that Corbusier makes projects like the one in Alger, the Plan Obus, with its curvilinearity. It's a kind of figure now developed out from that, I would say, enlarged ground of geometric figures. And I point you, in order to make it understandable, or more understandable to you, in terms of what it really means to reduce these observations to its more general geometric device, I give you this line of analogies used by Gideon, the friend of Corbusier, if you want, one of the far most important critiques of Corbusier's work. And you have to know that Corbusier professed as a typical Frenchman that he hates Roman Baroque. And Gideon, his friend, is now somehow going to say that the Plan Obus is somehow depending on Borromini's San Carlino, but naturally he's not saying that in historical terms by pointing to a mimetic process, but he simply says, as Borromini introduced the curvilinear mode to make his facade, and as John Wood used the curvilinear mode to apply the same geometric device to urban scale, Corbusier would make his project in Alger. So it's a transgression, if you want, of historical observation, which Gideon here applies, by the way, as a good scholar of Wölflin, and by which it is shown up that the more solid base of making this discussion is the abstracted discussion on the geometric figure, far more than any direct historical interdependence from one artifact to another. This as to notation, and I add a few things on systematics. Systematics, I already said that the 5 points would be the piece which is the best example to illustrate it, but I introduce it with this scheme from Domino. Now the tape is over. The domino, which is introduced not simply as being the revolution based on the invention of the ciment armé, of the concrete. Again, many critics have understood the domino being the application of the ciment armé by Corbusier. But if one reads Corbusier's own explanation, it becomes clear that he was not only proud of using that modern base, but he at the same time reacts, let's say, to the Vitruvian request and gives it also, or gives it through that particular new technical device, an aesthetical potential. He's very proud of having chosen that plan. With this pilotis or whatever, not on the edges of these tablets of ciment armé, so that immediately the architect would have a new potential, a new possibility, namely that of making any kind of facade. That's the naissance, that's the starting point of the façade libre. It is clear, it is very important to say that the technical, if you want, evolution or the technical progress is only a condition which is integrated in an architectural system or in an architectural science in order to use it or to abuse it to get things even better made than it was before. When we look to the 5 points, I don't have to listen it up, and I shouldn't go into details. We would find very much that the explanations are again of that same kind. To any of those 5 points, 3 observations are adjusted. The first is that through the invention of the Simo Armee, he would have get to new possibilities. The second is that all these new possibilities are very useful for human mankind. And third, that it gave satisfaction de l'esprit, a new potential for your artistic behavior. And if you, that's now a little bit, you have to believe it to me, but it is very, very parallel, it is very, very analogous to the Vitruvian 3 points of firmitas, the solidness, which is a necessity. Actually, the Simo Armee is necessity for the structural device. The usefulness, which is an advantage to introduce or to bring back architecture to your society. But third, and there is the autonomy of the architect, since if you follow most of the architectural theoreticians in that tradition, where architecture can express itself in artistic devices. So this is somehow the rounding up of Le Corbusier's Vitruvianism, if you want. Well, I had once I did once these schemes, but I don't now explain it to you, and I go to my little conclusion. My little conclusion, which says, naturally, I deliberately have chosen 2 contexts, Vitruvianism and Le Corbusier, just in order to say that these observations are not condensed or limited to any of those contexts, but that obviously the universal value of geometry has its own right of being, to say that it gives a better continuity to architecture than any of the mimetic historical dependencies. And if we look as a last series of slides to how Corbusier works with the image of history, he lives at a time where photography really becomes a big issue, and he had knowledge of another Swiss who at the time went to Greece and made these famous photographs of the Greek temple in Athens. And he uses these photographs as he uses photographs of his own work, and it is a very peculiar coincidence in these images. Images which do not only simply try to get a particularly nice effect of architecture, but somehow try to demonstrate that this result, this architectural result, is not casual, but it derives from that same, as he would say, esprit philosophique, by the way, philosophical spirit. He alludes again to the mental potential of architecture, and that therefore his architecture, he would like to say, is somehow equal or is somehow similar or analogous to the Greek temple, and not casually to the Greek temple, but to the Greek temple as there. All those values or all those ideals about systematics, about, if you want, architectural drawings and their discipline is by their best guaranteed. So I give you these images. You can put Villa Savoie and you can put the Parthenon. Naturally, it's not only the problem that you have pilotis and columns, but it is an analogy which Corbusier by himself explains by the effect that the mental capacity of a human activity could have, and he forms it up. That's why this mental capacity, and that's why I use, or I allow myself to bring together Daniele Barbaro and Corbusier. Daniele Barbaro, who was probably the most important figure in that process of making out of Vitruvius, more than a collection of knowledges, a systematic way of conceiving architecture, namely based on that other science which is the most systematic, geometry, and Corbusier, who actually followed at the same. So it's wrong again. And I just would add the last slide, but it doesn't work. Well, the one is over. That's the last slide, but I would have shown you it with the portrait of Corbusier. Corbusier has this sentence, architecte pure création de l'esprit. Naturally, as in his language, he's less explicit than is Daniele Barbaro in his very scientific comment. But the point is the same, that he defends architecture as not merely being a fulfillment of societal requirements, neither an explanation or a demonstration of new technologies, but it is far more than that. It is a creation of the spirit. It is making explicit of the specificity of architecture in terms of ratiocinatio, drawing, science, whatever you would like to have more of those terms. Thank you very much. That's it. And if you have questions, I'm ready to do it.
There is a reception at room A. Please, if there is any questions, please join us. It was fantastic. I don't know how to. You need some help? You need some help?
No, it's okay. I'm okay.
I think it's somehow, it's make people question something, and this, I think it's fantastic.
I'm quite satisfied. I guess I was simple enough and clear enough, I hope.
I think you are more than that. I mean, somehow, I do mean it, it's kind of.
I see.